6 months passed, and the first alien visitors arrived on Earth, and they came nervous and uncertain, and carrying the fears of their species with them, and they expected to find either primitive savages who stumbled through communication, or manipulative, masters of influence who could control minds with a glance. Instead, they found humans who were complex and contradictory, and struggling to build a better civilization while fighting against their own worst instincts, but also humans who could look at an alien visitor and understand their fear and their wonder and their hope without needing explanations. A Kelthoran engineer named Vrax was assigned to live in a city called Tokyo for 3 months, and he wrote in his personal journal about his experiences, and after being there for several weeks, he witnessed something that changed his understanding of humanity. He watched 2 humans have an argument in a public park, and they did not raise their voices or make threatening gestures, and through tiny movements and expressions that he was only beginning to recognize, they resolved a disagreement about where to eat dinner, and the whole thing took 30 seconds. Vrax wrote that his own species would have needed an hour of formal debate and protocol to settle such a simple matter, and he said he was starting to understand why the council had feared humans, and it was not because they were dangerous, but because they made everyone else look inefficient by comparison. A Thulian observer named Kessa was sent to study human cities, and she reported that human urban areas were chaotic compared to the ordered structures of her homeworld. But they functioned with remarkable coordination. She described witnessing what humans called rush hour in Tokyo, where millions of humans moved through transportation systems, and somehow they navigated around each other with minimal collision despite the incredible density. And she said they simply knew where others were going and what space they needed, and they flowed like water with each individual, aware of the whole ambassador Zroth, who had been among the most skeptical, requested permission to spend time on Earth himself. And he was granted a week to observe a human school, and he watched how children were taught and wrote a detailed report about what he learned. He noted that human children were trained to read the room and to put themselves in others' shoes and to listen to what was not being said. And these were not just lessons in politeness or etiquette, but training in the fundamental skill that made humanity unique. Zroth wrote that humans taught empathy the way his species taught mathematics, and it was a core subject that every child studied from their earliest years. And he said he finally understood why humans had been so slow to reach the stars. He explained that they had spent all that time learning to understand each other first, and perhaps the rest of the galaxy should have done the same before rushing out into space. The Council's whispers of fear gradually transformed into something else over those months, and it was not the absence of fear exactly, but recognition that fear could coexist with respect, and with curiosity, and with the willingness to learn. More aliens came to Earth, and they lived in human homes and worked in human offices and attended human schools, and slowly they began to see patterns they had never noticed before. They saw how human mothers could tell what their babies needed before they cried, and how human friends could communicate entire conversations with just glances, and how human co-workers could coordinate complex tasks with minimal verbal instruction. A delegation from the consensus of paired world spent a month studying human hospitals, and they watched doctors and nurses work together during emergency surgeries, and noted that the medical teams seemed to anticipate each other's needs and moved in perfect synchronization. Even under extreme stress, they asked a human surgeon named Dr. Karen White how this was possible, and she seemed confused by the question and said they just paid attention to each other and knew what their teammates needed, and she did not think this was anything special. This was the revelation that struck the alien observers most powerfully, and humans themselves did not realize how extraordinary their abilities were, because to them it was simply normal, and they had never known any other way to exist. Back at the Council Station, Lisa and her team established the Institute for Xenological Empathy in Species from across the galaxy, sent representatives to learn what humans could teach. The classes were not about biology or technology, but about observation and attention and patience, and the instructors taught aliens to slow down and notice the subtle signals they had been missing their entire lives. A Vorthine student named Krell Jr., who was the ambassador's son, attended the institute for 6 months, and at first he was frustrated because the lesson seemed too simple and obvious. But gradually he began to notice things he had never seen before, and he realized that when his father crossed 2 of his 6 arms, it meant he was uncertain, and when he crossed 4 arms, it meant he was determined, and these were signals he had looked at his entire life without truly seeing. The human teachers explained that this was the beginning, and that every species had their own version of nonverbal communication, but most had stopped paying attention to it because they relied so heavily on technology and translation devices. They taught that understanding did not come from hearing words but from observing the whole person and considering context and history and motivation and emotion together as one complete picture. Human mediators began working in the Council's Conflict Resolution Division, and they were assigned to disputes that had been deadlocked for years, and in many cases they helped both sides realize they were not actually disagreeing about what they thought they were disagreeing about. 2 species called the Harken and the Vrel had been fighting over trade routes for a decade, and both sides had dug into their positions and refused to compromise a human. A mediator named Linda Cooper spent 2 weeks meeting with representatives from both species separately, and she did not propose solutions or try to negotiate, and instead she just listened and observed and asked questions. Then she brought both sides together and explained that the Harken were not really concerned about the trade routes themselves, but about being respected by the larger galactic community, and they felt that giving up the routes would make them look weak. She told the Vrel that they were not actually interested in the economic benefits of the routes but were acting out of spite, because they felt the Harken had insulted them in a previous negotiation. Both sides were shocked that their real motivations had been understood so clearly, and once these underlying issues were addressed openly, the trade route dispute was resolved in a single afternoon. Stories like this spread throughout the Council, and slowly, the fear that had dominated initial reactions to humanity began to fade, and it was replaced by a growing appreciation for what humans could contribute. The Oversight Committee that had been assigned to monitor humanity for 10 years found that their job was remarkably boring, and humans did not engage in secret conspiracies or hidden political maneuvering. In fact, the committee discovered that humans were almost painfully honest in their dealings with other species because they found deception so uncomfortable and exhausting. After 3 years of observation, the committee chair, who was a Thulian named Vex Jr., reported that humanity posed no threat to Council security, and if anything, they were too transparent for their own political good. But the real transformation happened not in government or in formal institutions, but in the daily interactions between humans and aliens across the galaxy alien. Students who studied on Earth returned home, changed, and they had learned to pay attention in new ways and to look for meaning beyond words, and slowly they began teaching others. Cultural exchange program brought human artists and musicians and writers to alien worlds, and they did not try to make aliens act like humans, but instead they showed aliens how to understand their own species better. On a world called Brinthos, a human theater director named Chris Martinez worked with local actors to create a play about Brintic's history, and he taught them techniques that human actors used to convey emotion and subtext. The Brintic's actors had always performed in a very literal style, where every emotion was stated clearly and every motivation was explained. But Chris showed them how to suggest feelings through gesture and timing and implication. The resulting performance was revolutionary for Brintic's culture, and it showed them that their own crystalline bodies could communicate in ways they had never explored. 10 years after humanity joined the Council, the Oversight Committee filed its final report, and after a decade of observation and investigation and analysis, their conclusion was unanimous. The report stated that humanity had not only fulfilled the conditions of their membership, but exceeded them, and the Institute for Xenological Empathy had trained over 10,000 representatives from 300 species, and human mediators had resolved 47 major disputes and countless minor conflicts. Most significantly, the report noted that humanity's presence had begun to shift the culture of the Council itself, and debates were shorter now, and misunderstandings less common, and species that had barely spoken to each other for centuries were finding common ground. The committee recommended full, unconditional membership with all rights and privileges, and the vote was unanimous, and there was no dissent and no objections. Lisa Grant, who was now older and carried the title of Council Mediator. The Council's private deliberation chambers had never witnessed such deep division before. And for 3 days representatives argued and debated and struggled to reach any kind of agreement, and the elder species who had founded the council thousands of years ago were split completely down the middle, with some seeing humanity as the next evolution of civilization, while others saw them as a fundamental threat to the order that had maintained galactic peace for 10,000 years in their quarters. The human delegation waited, but they did not spend the time doing nothing, and requests for private meetings flooded in from individual species, and each one wanted to understand more about human capabilities, and each had their own reasons and their own agendas. Helen met with scientists from the Brintix Commonwealth and explained the neurological basis of human empathy in terms their crystalline logic could process, and she showed them brain scans and genetic data and talked about mirror, neurons and electromagnetic field detection and all the biological mechanisms that made humans unique. Jake spoke with military representatives from 3 different species and carefully demonstrated how human coordination worked in tactical situations, and he was very careful not to reveal anything that could be used against Earth. But he showed enough to prove that humans were not a military threat, just a species that worked together unusually well. Lisa took the most difficult meetings and sat across from ambassadors who still feared what humanity represented, and she did not try to convince them or argue with them, and instead she let them talk and let them voice their concerns. And she reflected back their worries with perfect understanding. She met with a delegation from the Outer Rim Confederacy, and their leader was Ambassador Toran, whose reptilian features were drawn tight with anxiety. And Lisa said directly that he was afraid humans would manipulate the council and form voting blocs that could not be detected and coordinate political movements that no one could counter. Toran admitted this was exactly his fear, and Lisa said simply that humans could do these things just as his species could use their natural camouflage abilities to spy on other delegations, and just as the Vorthane could use their quantum processing to break encryption, they had agreed not to touch, and just as the Thulians could use their electromagnetic perception to eavesdrop on private communications. Toran's eyes widened, and he said they had safeguards against such abuses, and Lisa agreed, and explained that the same safeguards would apply to humans through laws and norms and mutual surveillance and consequences. But she said there was something more important that protected everyone from human manipulation. She leaned forward and told Toran that humans evolved to live in small tribes where everyone knew everyone else, and when you know the people you are affecting and when you can feel their pain and their joy and their fear, it becomes very difficult to harm them casually. And humans had expanded this empathy beyond their immediate groups, but it was still there. Lisa explained that most humans struggled to hurt others, even enemies once. They truly understood them as people. And Toran pointed out that humans did harm each other and had wars, and Lisa acknowledged this and said yes when human values conflicted so deeply that understanding did not matter, and when they were defending something they believed was worth the cost. She told him that humans did not stumble into harm the way species that could not read each other might, and when humans hurt others they almost always knew exactly what they were doing and why. And she met his gaze directly and asked if he wanted to know if humans would abuse their abilities. Lisa said the answer was that some humans might, because humans were individuals, and some were cruel or selfish or hungry for power. But as a species and as a civilization seeking council membership, they were offering something valuable, and they were offering to be the bridge between species that struggled to understand each other. The meeting ended without full resolution, but Toran left thoughtful, rather than hostile. And this was the best Lisa could hope for, and she had similar conversations with dozens of other representatives over those 3 days. On the 4th day, the council reconvened and the chamber was packed again, but the atmosphere was different, and the fear remained, but it was joined by anticipation and by the sense that something significant was about to unfold. Councillor Vex stood at the primary podium, and his aged face looked solemn and tired, and he said that the council had deliberated on the question of humanity's membership, and this had been one of the most challenging decisions in recent history, and they found themselves faced with a species that defied their understanding and operated by rules they did not fully comprehend. He paused, and the entire chamber held its breath, and every being present waited to hear what would come next, and Lisa felt her team's attention sharpen, though none of them moved visibly. Vex announced that after extensive debate, they had reached a decision, but it came with conditions that had never before been applied to any member species. and he said that humanity would be granted full council membership, and a wave of reactions swept through the chamber with shouts of approval and protest mixing together. Vex raised his hand for silence and continued by explaining that this membership came with 3 binding requirements, and he said first that humanity would establish an institute for xenological empathy that would be open to all council species, and where humans would teach what could be taught of their understanding abilities. He clarified that they could not force humans to share what was biological, but they would share their methods and techniques and insights, and Lisa stood and said clearly that they accepted this condition. Vex announced the second requirement, which was that a team of human mediators would be assigned to the Council's Conflict Resolution Division, and they would serve as neutral parties in disputes between species and help to clarify intent and reduce misunderstanding. And Lisa said they accepted. The third requirement was harder, and Vex said that humans would submit to ongoing monitoring by a Council Oversight Committee. And this was not to spy on their methods, but to ensure they were not abusing their abilities for political gain. And this monitoring would continue for a probationary period of 10 standard years, after which it would be reviewed. Jake tensed in his seat, and Helen frowned and Peter looked concerned, but Lisa felt the rightness of this requirement and understood the fear that motivated it, and knew it was a reasonable price to pay. She said clearly that they accepted all 3 conditions, but asked for one thing in return, and Vex's expression suggested he had expected this, and he told her to speak. Lisa proposed that the Council send an expedition to Earth, and not just ambassadors and scientists, but ordinary citizens from across the Council, and let them live among humans and experience how they interacted and understand what humanity was offering. From the inside, she said that fear thrived in ignorance, and asked them to let humans show the Council who they really were. And the chamber erupted in discussion again because the proposal was unprecedented, and species generally did not invite mass visitation until long after achieving full membership. But Krell surprisingly stood in support and said the humans had a point and they feared what they did not understand, and perhaps it was time they tried understanding. And the vote on Lisa's proposal passed by a narrow margin. It was decided that within 6 months, the first exchange program would begin, and hundreds of aliens would descend on Earth and live in human cities and work alongside human colleagues, and experience firsthand what it meant to be a species that communicated as much through silence as through words. As the session concluded, and the reality of full council membership sank in, the human delegation remained in their box and allowed the chamber to empty around them. And they sat in comfortable silence, and shared the weight and wonder of what they had achieved. Jake said quietly that the aliens were still afraid, and Helen replied that they should be because humans represented change and the Council had operated the same way for thousands of years. And now that would be disrupted. Peter, who was the youngest member of their delegation, looked around at his colleagues and asked if they would really be able to teach the aliens, and wondered how you could teach instinct. Lisa considered this question carefully and said they could not teach aliens to be human, but they could teach them to pay attention differently and to look for signals they had been missing, and some species would be better at it than others, but even small improvements in understanding could prevent conflicts and save lives. Jake asked how this would change Earth, and it was the question they had all been thinking about, and humanity had just gained access to galactic civilization and to technologies and knowledge beyond their wildest dreams. But they had also put themselves on a stage where every action would be scrutinized and every choice examined for hidden motives. Lisa said it made them responsible for living up to what they had claimed to be, and for proving that understanding could be stronger than fear, and she stood, and the others rose with her, and they left the council chamber together. They walked through corridors that no longer felt quite so alien and past species, that no longer seemed quite so foreign. And that evening the first message reached Earth from the Council station, and it was transmitted on every frequency and translated into every human language and broadcast to every corner of humanity's homeworld. The entire chamber fell silent as Lisa reached the podium, and she could feel hundreds of alien eyes watching her from every direction, and some of those eyes were filled with curiosity, and some with fear, and some with anger. But all of them wanted to understand what made humans so different and so potentially dangerous. She began speaking in a clear voice that carried through the massive room, and she thanked the Council for allowing her to address them, and said she understood their concerns, and understood that human methods seemed mysterious and perhaps threatening, and explained that she was not there to defend her species, but to help everyone understand what humans truly were. Lisa paused and looked around at the vast array of different life forms, and she said that every species in this chamber had evolved remarkable abilities, and the Vorthine could process quantum calculations in their brains, and the Thulians could see parts of the electromagnetic spectrum that most species could not detect, and the Brintics could survive in temperatures that would destroy organic life. And all these evolutionary advantages had been used to build a magnificent civilization among the stars. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, and aliens nodded or made whatever gestures their species used to show approval. And Lisa continued by saying that humanity had evolved differently, and humans came from a world where survival depended not on individual strength, but on working together as groups. She explained that human ancestors were not the fastest creatures on Earth, and not the strongest, and not the most adaptable. But what saved them and allowed them to thrive was their ability to cooperate and to understand each other. And she gestured toward her delegation and said that what the council had witnessed over the past months was not technology or telepathy, but millions of years of social evolution. Lisa told them that humans read each other through 1,000 subtle signals, and the slight tension in someone's posture, and the microscopic movements of facial muscles, and the rhythm of breathing, and the electromagnetic signatures that emotional states created, and pheromones that conveyed information below, conscious awareness, and even quantum effects in neural tissue that created patterns of coherence. The chamber was absolutely silent now, and every being present was focused completely on her words. And she said that humans were not hive-minded, and each person was completely individual with their own thoughts and desires and choices, but they were also deeply and fundamentally connected in ways that did not require technology to explain, and in ways that existed before language itself. Ambassador Zroth leaned forward in his seat and interrupted to ask if she was really saying that humans could communicate detailed information without any technological or biological transmission that could be detected, and Lisa clarified that they did not transmit detailed information the way he meant, and they did not send words or data, but instead they shared understanding and intent and emotion and context. She explained it was closer to how you might know a friend is upset before they speak, but refined through millions of generations of selection pressure, and humans who could coordinate hunts more effectively survived. To have children and humans who could warn their tribe of danger without alerting prey lived longer, and humans who could read subtle social dynamics avoided conflicts and formed stronger communities. Lisa let this information sink in for a moment, and the aliens were processing what she had told them and trying to understand how this was possible, and she said she understood why this frightened them, because their civilizations had built elaborate systems of communication and translation and verification, precisely because misunderstanding between species was so common. She continued by saying that humans rarely misunderstood each other, at least not when they were paying attention, and they knew what their companions meant even when the words said something else. And this was humanity's greatest strength. But also what made other species nervous. Krell interrupted, and his voice was sharp with concern, and he said this was precisely what worried the council. And he asked how they could trust humans when they could coordinate actions that could not be monitored, and how could anyone ensure humans were not planning against council interests. Lisa smiled and said that the counselor had asked a good question, and she told him that humanity's greatest weakness was that they could not lie to each other effectively, and a human who spoke words that did not match their true intent was immediately obvious to other humans because they felt the discord, and the entire species was built on authentic communication. She explained that deception between humans required enormous effort and training, and even then they usually saw through it, and this meant that humans found it very difficult to be dishonest with each other in any sustained way. And she turned to address the full chamber and said that the council feared what they could not observe. Lisa asked them to consider that every war their species had fought began with misunderstanding, and every trade dispute, and every territorial conflict, and every grudge carried across generations started because two parties could not truly grasp each other's perspective, and they had built elaborate systems to prevent these misunderstandings. But they still occurred regularly. A representative from the consensus of paired worlds pointed out that humanity had wars too. And Lisa acknowledged this immediately and said yes. Humans fought wars, but not because they misunderstood each other, and human conflicts arose from genuine disagreement about values or resources or ideology. And when humans went to war, they knew exactly what they were fighting over. She explained that humans did not stumble into conflict through poor communication, and their wars were terrible, but they were honest about what caused them. And she walked slowly across the podium, making eye contact with representatives throughout the chamber, and said that what humanity was offering the council was not a threat, but a bridge. Lisa told them that humans could serve as mediators, precisely because they were so good at understanding intent, and they could help translate not just words but meaning between species who spoke past each other. And she said this was valuable in a galaxy where most conflicts arose from simple failures of communication. Zroth stood up and challenged her to prove it, and he said if humans could truly understand intent so well, then she should tell him what he was thinking right now, and the chamber waited to see how Lisa would respond to this test. She looked at Zroth for a long moment and studied his posture and the way he held his body and the tension in his voice and the patterns of his breathing and dozens of other tiny signals, and then she spoke and said he was not convinced, and he thought she was using rhetorical tricks to hide some deeper agenda. Lisa continued and said that Zroth also wanted to believe her because he remembered a time when his species almost destroyed itself through a misunderstanding between their homeworld and their first colony, and she said he had spent his career trying to prevent that from happening again, and right now, he was wondering if maybe humans really could help. The color drained from Zroth's face, and everything Lisa had said was accurate, including details about his personal history that were not in any public records, and he asked in a whisper how she knew these things. Lisa explained calmly that she had observed his posture when he challenged her, and the way his eyes tracked to a Kelthoran historical display when he mentioned proof, and the minute tension in his stance that suggested old trauma, and the catch in his breath when she mentioned mediation, and she told him she was not reading his mind but reading him as a person. The chamber erupted in discussion, and some representatives were excited and others were terrified, and many were simply confused. And Lisa stood calmly at the podium and let them talk and process what they had just witnessed. And after several minutes, Counselor Vex called for order. Vex said that Ambassador Grant had given them much to consider, but he had a question, and he asked if humans could understand each other so perfectly. Then why did it take them so long to achieve space travel? And why were human civilizations on Earth still divided into different nations and groups? It was a good question, and Lisa had expected someone to ask it, and she explained that understanding did not solve everything, and humans could disagree profoundly, even when they understood each other perfectly. And they had different values and different priorities and different visions of the future. Lisa said that human history was full of conflicts, where both sides knew exactly what the other wanted and still chose to fight for their own vision, and what humans were good. It was making sure everyone knew what they were really arguing about, and she paused before continuing. She told Vex that he was right, that it had slowed humanity down, and while other species were building vast civilizations through efficient communication networks, humans were struggling through the messy process of building consensus among beings who understood each other's emotions all too clearly. Lisa explained that every human felt the pain they caused others, and every human knew when they were being cruel or selfish because they could sense the impact in real time, and this made them slow to act sometimes, but it also made them very careful about how they treated each other. And Jake called out from the delegation box that this was true. Most of the time, and scattered nervous laughter rippled through the chamber. Lisa smiled and agreed that humans were not perfect, but they were. The council whispered in fear, for humanity needed no words. The giant room stretched so far that Lisa Grant could barely see the other end, and the ceiling was so high it looked like a sky full of fake stars, and all around her sat creatures from hundreds of different worlds with strange bodies and stranger faces, and they all wore devices on their heads or necks that made their words understandable to everyone else. And at the front of the room stood a tall being with 6 arms, who was speaking in a loud voice that echoed through the chamber. And his name was Krell, and he was from a place called the Vorthine Collective, and he was telling everyone that humans could join their group, but only if they followed the rules. Lisa sat very still in her chair, And next to her was Jake Morrison, who kept shifting around because the fancy clothes they had to wear were uncomfortable. And behind them sat Helen Price, who was looking at her computer tablet and trying not to show any emotion on her face, and Krell kept talking about how humans needed to use the right technology to talk during meetings, because their normal way of speaking was too simple for such an important place. And Lisa felt something building up inside, her head like pressure before a storm, and she knew without looking that Jake and Helen felt it too. And that was the thing the aliens did not understand about humans. The meeting ended after Krell said humans had to prove they could communicate properly. And all the strange creatures started leaving through the doors, and some of them stopped to stare at the humans with their weird eyes and multiple heads and other body parts that Lisa had never seen before. And she stood up along with Jake and Helen and the 3 other humans who were part of their group, and they walked out together through hallways that seemed to go on forever. And the walls were made of something that looked like crystal but felt warm when you got close to. That night in their rooms on the space station, Lisa gathered everyone together, and there were 7 humans total, including a young man named Peter Wells, who had just started working as a diplomat. And they all sat down in a circle, and Lisa looked at Jake, and he understood everything she was thinking without her saying a word. And Helen glanced at Peter, and suddenly he knew things that would have taken days to explain with normal talking. And this was what made humans special, and what the aliens had not discovered yet. Jake spoke out loud because they knew the aliens might be listening through hidden devices, and he said the aliens think we are simple. But his real message was completely different, and it was about their plans for the next few months, and Lisa answered him with words about letting them think whatever they want. But what she really communicated was a detailed strategy that filled everyone's minds with understanding, and this happened so fast that no machine could have caught it, and no alien would have believed it was possible. Humans had something that other species did not have, and it was not magic or technology or anything that could be measured by the aliens' fancy tools, and it was the ability to understand each other without words through tiny movements of their faces, and the way they stood, and the feelings that moved between them when they were close enough to sense each other's presence. And back on Earth, people called it intuition, or empathy, or reading body language, but it was so much more than that. And out here in space, where every other species needed translators and computers to communicate, it made humans completely unique. On Earth, this ability had always been there, but humans themselves did not realize how special it was, and they thought everyone could do it. And mothers knew when their babies needed something before they cried, and soldiers in battle could work together without speaking, and friends could tell when something was wrong just by looking at each other, and lovers understood feelings that were never put into words, and this was just normal human life. But compared to the aliens who needed everything spelled out clearly and transmitted through devices, it was like having a superpower. Lisa and her team spent the next few weeks going to meetings and voting on small decisions about trade between planets, and they did everything the council asked them to do, and they used their translation devices and spoke when they were supposed to speak and followed every single rule perfectly. But they also watched everything carefully and learned about how the aliens thought and acted. And all of this information passed between the humans through channels that the council could not see or measure or understand. The first sign that something was different came during a big argument between 2 alien groups called the Kelthorans and the Brintics, and they were fighting about who could mine metals from some asteroids in a faraway part of space. And their ambassadors stood on opposite sides of the room shouting through their translators and getting angrier and angrier, and all their friends were taking sides, and the whole thing was about to explode into something worse. A mediator named Vex, who came from a species called the Thulians, said they needed someone neutral to look at the evidence and make a recommendation, and everyone in the room went quiet because every single species there had reasons to support one side or the other except for one group. And Vex turned to look at Lisa and said the humans had no reason to favor either side, and asked if they would take on this responsibility. Lisa stood up, and every alien eye in the room focused on her, and the moment felt heavy with importance, and she said yes, they would accept. And then she sat back down, and the meeting continued. But something else had happened in that brief moment that most of the aliens did not notice, and the 6 other humans in their section had received her complete analysis of the situation and understood all the political implications, and saw the opportunity this presented and agreed with her decision. And all of this happened In the space of a single breath, no messages were sent and no words were spoken and no technology was used, and it was just pure instant understanding between humans who had evolved over millions of years to work together, and a Kelthoran ambassador named Zroth noticed something strange about how the humans had not talked to each other, or looked at each other, or done anything that normal species do when making important decisions, and they had just somehow agreed immediately, and he felt uncomfortable, but could not explain why, and he made a mental note to pay more attention to these strange creatures from Earth. The humans spent 3 days working on the mining problem, and they spread out across different rooms in their quarters, and sometimes hours would pass without anyone speaking out loud. But when they finished their report, it read like one person had written it, because in a way that was exactly what had happened, and their minds had worked together in a dance of understanding that needed no words or explanations. Lisa presented their solution to the council, and she explained that the Kelthorans should get the mining rights, but the Brintics should get exclusive contracts to refine the metals, and both sides would make money, and neither side would lose face, and it was an elegant compromise that no one had thought of before. The room exploded with discussion, and aliens were talking loudly in dozens of languages, all translated into a chaos of sound, and both the Kelthorans and Brintics were nodding and seemed satisfied, but Zroth was not paying attention to the proposal, and instead he was watching the human delegation, and they sat completely still. But he had a weird feeling that they were talking to each other in some way he could not detect, and their faces showed tiny expressions that appeared and vanished in milliseconds, and their bodies shifted in patterns that seemed meaningful, but made no sense. After the meeting ended, Zroth went to find Ambassador Scylla from the Brintics, who was made of living crystal, and he asked if she had noticed anything unusual about the humans. And Scylla's body shimmered with thought, and she said they were efficient and perhaps smarter than expected. But Zroth pressed further and asked how they had reached agreement so quickly, and Scylla said they must have used their communication devices. Zroth shook his head and explained that he had monitored all electromagnetic signals in the human section during the meeting, and there had been nothing and no transmissions of any kind, and Scylla's crystalline form flickered with worry, and she asked how else they could have coordinated, and Zroth had no answer. But he knew something impossible had just happened, and he decided to watch the humans much more carefully from now on. Over the next few weeks, more aliens started noticing the same strange things about humans, and these were some of the smartest political minds in the entire galaxy, and they saw that human delegations moved together like they were connected by invisible strings, and they never contradicted each other and never seemed surprised by what their teammates said, and never needed time to think things over before agreeing on something important. During one long negotiation about sending aid to poor planets, Jake Morrison answered questions from 16 different aliens over 2 hours, and not once did he need to check with his team, and not once did his answers conflict with what other humans had said before, and some of the observers started whispering to each other about how strange this was, and one ambassador said it was like the humans shared a single brain, but that was not quite right. The truth was that each human had their own complete personality and their own thoughts and desires, and they were all completely individual. But they also understood each other at a level that made talking seem crude and slow, like trying to communicate by banging rocks together, when you could just reach out and touch someone's mind. Ambassador Krell spoke quietly to his assistant one evening and said he thought the humans might have a hive mind like some insect species, and the assistant looked worried and asked what they should do about it, but Krell had no answer because the council had never encountered anything like this before. In secret rooms where only the oldest and most powerful species met without any junior members present, the topic of humanity dominated every conversation, and Counselor Vex said they needed to understand how humans were doing this, and another leader insisted they should test the humans and see if they could coordinate without any possible way to communicate, and everyone agreed. This was necessary. The test was designed to look like a normal emergency. Drill and the humans were separated across different parts of the huge space station when alarms started blaring about a fake hull breach, and each human was put with observers from different species in locked rooms, with all communication blocked, and the test required each group to solve part of a complex problem, and all the solutions had to fit together perfectly for the overall plan to work. Lisa found herself sealed in a maintenance bay with 3 Kelthoran engineers, and Jake was 2 kilometers away in a medical center, and Helen had been sent to the agricultural domes where food was grown, and the rest of their team was scattered just as far apart. And the Kelthorans watched Lisa very carefully as she looked at the problem in front of her. They needed to redirect power through damaged conduits to restore life support to a section where people were supposedly trapped, and her solution needed to account for decisions being made by the other groups, even though she could not contact any of them. And the Kelthorans checked their instruments over and over to confirm that no signals were being sent or received from Lisa's location. What they could not detect was something that had evolved over millions of years in human ancestors, and it was the bond between human minds that worked below conscious thought in a place deeper than technology could reach. And it was like how a mother somehow knows her child is in danger, even from far away, and how soldiers know where their teammates are in the chaos of battle, and how people who love each other can sense what the other needs before asking. And for humans, this was amplified and refined beyond anything their ancient relatives could have imagined. Lisa closed her eyes and breathed slowly, and in that moment of stillness she felt the presence of her team. And it was not telepathy where thoughts are transmitted from mind to mind, and it was not technology sending data through space, and it was something more fundamental that connected humans who trusted each other and had learned to work as one. She opened her eyes and started working with confident movements, and the Kelthorans looked at each other in confusion as she made choices that seemed random but somehow aligned perfectly with what the entire plan required. And across the station, every human delegation member did exactly the same thing, and no communication passed between them that any instrument could measure. But they worked, as one unit anyway. When the drill ended, the observers were shocked by the results, and the human delegation had achieved perfect coordination, and every decision made by isolated members had fit together without a single mistake. And the odds of this happening by random chance were so small that it was essentially impossible. Krell demanded to speak with Lisa immediately, and when all the humans were brought back together, he stood in front of them with all 6 arms crossed and asked how they had done it, and his voice was angry and frightened at the same time. And Lisa looked at him calmly and said they were human, and they understood each other. Krell shouted that this was not an answer, and Lisa replied that it was the only answer they had, and explained that they did not fully understand it themselves and they just knew it worked. And this was not entirely true because human scientists had spent decades studying their unique ability after making contact with aliens revealed how unusual it was. The scientists had discovered it was based on mirror neurons in the brain that let humans instinctively copy and understand the emotions and intentions of others, and it involved electromagnetic fields generated by the heart and brain that other humans could subconsciously detect, and it included pheromones too subtle for conscious awareness that carried information about emotional states, and there were even quantum effects in neural tissue that might create entanglement between human minds in close proximity. But explaining all of this to the council would only make them more afraid, and it was better to let them think it was just instinct and intuition, and something too primitive to be threatening. And Lisa knew this strategy would buy them time even though it would not solve the larger problem. The council held emergency meetings that lasted through the night cycles of the station, and some members wanted to kick humanity out immediately, and others argued they should study humans more, and a group led by Ambassador Scylla suggested that maybe humans could teach their ability to other species. But most of the council felt only fear, and they asked what else humans could do, and what other capabilities had they hidden, and if they could coordinate perfectly without technology, then what stopped them from planning in secret and arranging strategies that no surveillance could detect or prevent? A representative from something called the Consortium of Enlightened Minds stood up and said that humans could be plotting anything at any moment, and every time they spent together, they could be sharing information and making plans and organizing actions that no one else could perceive or counter. And this speech frightened many of the assembled aliens. The vote came suddenly and was pushed through by the frightened majority, and humanity's probationary status would be suspended, and they would be asked, politely but firmly, to leave the council station and return to Earth and forget about joining the galactic community. When the official notice arrived at the human quarters, Lisa read it without any surprise on her face, and she had felt the shift in the council's mood days before this. and had sensed the trajectory of their discussions through 1,000 small interactions during meetings and casual encounters in the hallways, and she had known this was coming. She gathered her team and they sat together in their common room, and Lisa said out loud that the aliens were afraid, and Jake nodded and asked what they should do now. And his question carried layers of meaning about their options, and the political situation, and the future of Earth's relationship with the galaxy. Lisa's answer was simple in words but complex in meaning, and she said now they would show the aliens what they were really afraid of, and everyone in the room understood her plan immediately, and felt the rightness of it, and knew the risk, but also knew it was their only chance. The next morning, Lisa submitted a formal request to address the full council assembly before their membership was officially terminated, and Krell was annoyed when he received the petition and told her this was highly irregular and that humans were not full members and had no right to address the entire council. Lisa held up her tablet, showing the relevant section of the council charter, and explained that the law allowed any species to speak before their membership status was altered, and she said they were not asking for a vote but just asking to be heard. And Krell's primary arms twitched with irritation, but the law was clear and he could not deny them. The word spread quickly through the station that the humans would make a final address, and everyone wanted to see what would happen. And on the day of the speech, the council chamber was more crowded than it had been in years, with representatives filling not just their usual seats, but also the observation galleries that ringed the upper levels. Lisa would stand alone at the central podium, while her team sat in their delegation box, and she would have one chance to explain what humans really were, and one opportunity to turn fear into understanding. And as she walked toward the speaking platform, she felt the weight of her entire species resting on her shoulders, and knew that what happened in the next hour would determine whether humanity joined the stars or remained forever isolated on their single world.